The Chinese government depends on repression to stay in power. As a result, it views the defense of human rights as an existential threat. But because China is determined to prevent criticism, it also increasingly poses an existential threat to the rights of people everywhere. Now, the Chinese people are like everyone else. They want the right to live freely and in dignity. But President Xi Jinping is overseeing the most brutal and pervasive oppression that China has seen in decades. Civic groups are being shut down. Independent journalism is no more. Online conversation has been curtailed. Freedom for the people of Hong Kong is being challenged. And for the Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims of Xinjiang, China has imposed the most intrusive system of surveillance the world has ever seen and has detained 1 million people for forced indoctrination. Now, China is determined to avoid criticism of these deeply disturbing trends. It has long censored people within China. It is now trying to extend that censorship to the rest of the world. Now, some autocrats and dictators are happy to go along because they don't like the international human rights system either. Some powerful governments that could stand up to China have been too divided or distracted. Other governments have been willing to be bought off, such as by China's Belt and Road Initiative. And China is quite willing to use money to force censorship, whether of governments or businesses, by threatening to deny them access to the Chinese market, which represents some 16% of the world economy. The voice of the United Nations on human rights has also been a major target of China, and with considerable success. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres refuses to publicly seek an end to the mass detention of Turkic Muslims in Xinjiang. At the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva, China routinely opposes virtually any human rights initiative that firmly criticizes a particular government. At UN headquarters in New York, China is determined to avoid discussion of its misconduct in Xinjiang. And at the UN Security Council, China joins up with Russia to block any action on such human rights crises as Syria, Venezuela, and Myanmar. China basically is willing to leave victims to their fate in order to avoid creating a precedent of human rights enforcement that might boomerang on its own repressive rule. Now is the time to stand up to Beijing's assaults on the international human rights system. And there are things that governments can do. For example, they should stop pretending that quiet diplomacy suffices. If leaders visiting Chinese officials cannot be heard by the Chinese people, the real engines of change, their interventions are not going to make any difference at all. It's important to avoid double standards for China. For example, the world rightly criticized Trump when he appallingly separated children from their families on the US-Mexican border. Why not also stand up to Beijing when it forcibly separates children from their families in Xinjiang? And it's important to stand up to China's divide and conquer strategy. Governments should band together to challenge Beijing's repression. China cannot stand up to the entire world all at once. The bottom line is, now is the time to resist China's assaults on the international human rights system. Decades of progress on human rights are at stake. So is our future.